Hi! If you are new here, all you need to know is that I have watched the first season of the One Piece live-action adaptation, and now, for the first time ever, I am reading the manga, and, more specifically, the first 100 chapters that the live-action has covered so far. With all of that said, let's begin! Today I'll be covering the chapters in Volume 7, from 54 to 62. I absolutely loved this volume. The main thing we get here is, obviously, the Sanji and Zeph backstory. I can tell you right now that while I loved it in the live action, plus the live action made a couple good changes, but overall, this backstory in the manga felt so much stronger for multiple reasons I'll discuss later. Other than the backstory, we also continued with the fight against Krieg's pirates, and this volume really redeemed this plotline for me. Because if I'm being honest, I wasn't really invested in the action last volume. The main reasons were Gin, I think he's a fantastic character, and also Pearl, who was surprisingly entertaining. I still don't really care about Krieg, but he also didn't have the chance to do anything significant yet, so I don't want to judge too early. But let's go back to the beginning. We see Patty and the other guy whose name I don't know how to pronounce doing a pretty good job at fighting off Krieg's pirates. Then everything changed when the Fire Nation, when Pearl attacked. I really didn't think I would like this guy as much as I did. Even if, as a villain, he didn't really provide any depth, he was very entertaining. The whole story about Pearl growing up in the jungle and losing his mind at the mere sight of blood was hysterical. Also, he started setting things on fire, and I think that it brought a very fun additional element to this fight. Fire isn't just dangerous to people, but it also consumes the surroundings, so you can't fight carelessly. Plus, it was an interesting backdrop for a fight to have your characters literally stuck between water and fire. And, finally, Pearl using puns in his speech was also a fun detail, even when not everything can be easily translated from Japanese. You have no idea how much I loved the moment when one of the pirates tried to steal a knife from a wounded Patty and Sanji defended him, even if before that they were constantly at each other's throats. On one hand, it shows how much Sanji cares about the people around him despite his harsh exterior, but it also reminds us what things he values, what things he sees as treasure, what things he would be ready to die for. And this theme is continued as we see Sanji get very angry after being called a bunch of lousy cooks, and also as he promises to defeat Pearl with just his legs, because hands are too precious for cooks. After that, we see Pearl brag about no one being able to draw his blood in battle, and it was hilarious how Luffy immediately did exactly that without even trying. He didn't even notice that something happened, because he was simply happy about the fact that something got in the way of his flying trajectory before he could fall into water. I already mentioned how hilarious I found Pearl's crewmates screaming, "You're not in the jungle anymore," as well as all the chaos that followed. But, as always, Oda combines ridiculousness with cool moments, so in this case, the cool moment was Sanji jumping into action despite the flames and saying that you can't be a cook if you're afraid of fire. A cool moment from Sanji was immediately followed by a cool moment from Zeph, who, even with just one leg, easily kicked away a bunch of flaming projectiles flying in the direction of the restaurant. Krieg himself tries to interfere and attack Sanji, and I adored how Luffy jumped in to save him. It felt important. Luffy is protecting Sanji because in his mind, Sanji is already the official cook of his crew, and if something is important to his crew, Luffy will also fight for it. It was also funny how in the chaos of this attack, a massive mast from Krieg's ship fell on Pearl's head. He was getting destroyed so badly, but none of that was in the actual fight against his opponent. The funniest thing was how Luffy looked at him and just called him stupid. This is the best insult Luffy can make. If even someone like Luffy calls you stupid, then you know you seriously messed up. And then chapter 55 ends with a great cliffhanger, where we see Gin's betrayal as he points a gun at Zeff and also breaks his peg leg. I didn't expect it at all for someone who was a minor background character in the live action to be one of the standout characters in this arc in the manga, and I absolutely love it. In the next chapter, we see Sanji put his well-being on the line for Zeff and the restaurant. Zeff is obviously not happy about it, but Sanji doesn't budge, and he gets beaten insanely badly. It was truly heartbreaking to watch. Also, if you think about it, dodging instinctively is easier than staying rooted in place when you know pain and injury is coming, so it shows how strong-willed Sanji is, enough to fit in perfectly with Luffy's crew of crazy people. And that's where we jump into the backstory. I know some people like to make fun of using many long backstories as a storytelling device, but I don't care. The point is that backstories simply work, assuming they are done well. So I say give me more of them. Speaking about this specific backstory, while the live action didn't change too many things, they did cut out some key things, and I am so glad I'm reading the manga so that I can get these things now. The scene starts with the discussion about the All Blue, while in the live action, this concept was introduced by Sanji himself talking about it to Luffy. But the first important change comes after that. We see the other cooks eating leftovers from their customers, while Sanji just throws it all away. This was an insanely great detail. In the live action, while I obviously didn't expect Kid Sanji to respect food as much as he does after knowing what hunger feels like, but I definitely didn't think he would be someone who would straight up waste food. Everything that happens to him after that hits so much harder due to this one relatively small detail. Next, the pirates attack, more specifically Zeff's pirates. I really love his design in younger days. He shouldn't look cool, but he does. He has literal bows in his mustache, and his clothes are decorated with small fish and seashells, and yet he still somehow looks intimidating. In addition to that, his pirate flag is so funny, probably the funniest one that I've seen so far. We had Zoro present this idea that a pirate flag should inspire terror, but Zeff's flag is ridiculous. What inspires terror is his name, not the design of his flag. It feels intentional, like trying to say that someone like Zeff doesn't need to act scary to be scary. It can even be the opposite. Surrounding yourself with superficial symbols to show your power only shows inflated ego and attempts to overcompensate. Even if we go back to the previous volume, we saw Mihawk literally show up on a raft, not even a ship, and I don't think there's a single person in this world who would look at Mihawk and not think that he is cool and intimidating. But going back to Zeff, we see his pirates stealing everything they can, but the thing where Zeff draws the line is food. This is such an interesting piece of characterization. I think it shows how every person views the world through their own personal lens of morality and acts according to that, even if their actions might seem crazy to other people. Next, we see Sanji trying to fight the pirates because he believed he would be killed otherwise. I found it very funny how the pirates themselves asked the cooks to do something about Sanji because they didn't want him provoking the captain. Also, Oda was pure evil for including one small detail here, and that was Sanji biting the leg that Zeff later ends up eating. Like I said, pure evil. Here is also the moment where Zeff hears that Sanji dreams of finding the All Blue. The cooks can't believe he's still talking about that when their lives are in real danger. Zeff's pirates laugh at that, but Zeff himself doesn't say anything, and we obviously know why that is, because he shares the same dream. Then a giant wave washes Sanji off the ship, and we get the second key change that the live action made. Zeff jumps in to save Sanji. His pirates scream that this kid isn't worth it, but the beautiful thing is that jumping after Sanji is probably the reason why he even survived when his ship got wrecked. There's something very beautiful about that. The thing that seems like a misfortune ends up being a blessing. It's true in real life too. In my native language, we have this idiom. If we knew where we'd fall, we'd put a pillow there. But in reality, you never know what will happen, so all you can do is make the decisions you'll regret the least in any given moment, and that's what Zeff did here. Another thematic thing I want to discuss is the ironic fact that Zeff survived Grand Line only to lose his ship in a regular storm. I feel like that ties to my previous point, but also to the Straw Hats and their dreams. They have crazy goals, and trying to reach those goals will put them in an incredibly huge danger. But the alternative isn't better. Trying to stay safe doesn't guarantee your safety. It only guarantees a life full of regrets. This situation also reminds me of Zoro's backstory. Kuina died because she fell and hit her head. Just like that. It happened out of nowhere. So it makes sense that Zoro now has such a cold view on death because he knows how quick and unexpected it can be. When you keep that in mind, risking your life to reach your dreams feels worth it. In conclusion, I think this part in the manga had very strong writing, with all the themes tying into the broader themes of the whole story nicely. The next scene shows Zeff and Sanji on the top of that rock. In the live action, this conversation played out pretty much the same, so there's not much to say. I only want to mention some things about the art. First, I love the detail that the silhouette of that rock looks like the top part of a chef's hat. I also want to praise the paneling of this part in the manga. There were so many panels with a lot of negative space, enhancing that feeling of being completely alone and waiting with nothing better to do, and all the hopelessness that was slowly setting in. Another great thing was the dissonance between the absolutely horrifying situation our characters were in and the breathtakingly beautiful landscape, especially in the panels taking place during sunset. There was little dialogue in this part of the manga, but the drawings spoke for themselves. However, I also have to say that there's one thing that the live action did better, and that was not showing Zeff's leg until the very end, while in the manga, he was shown cutting it off very early on. It made it just a little bit more difficult to connect the dots in the live action, making the eventual reveal hit harder. After this short interruption, the manga goes back to Sanji, and I really felt him going through it despite already knowing what happens in this part of the story. I think it's a sign of great writing when you can make your audience just as emotional as they were the first time experiencing the story. I absolutely loved the quick flashbacks Sanji had to how he used to waste food. He remembered one of the cooks teasing him by dangling a half-eaten fish in front of him, but now Sanji would give anything to actually get that leftover fish. And then Oda twisted the knife even more by making Sanji accidentally drop the last piece of bread he had while he was crying thinking about the past. We see some more passage of time. If I'm being honest, the fact that Sanji survived for 2 whole months even after the last of his food was gone felt like a bit of a stretch even for me, and I am not even bringing in Zeph's situation into this conversation. However, I can let it slide because the world of One Piece is supposed to be absolutely crazy, plus the point of this story is the emotion and the impact it had on these characters and not dry logic. The backstory ends with Sanji going to see Zeph and all the reveals that happened there. Once again, the live action didn't change much with this scene. The only change I want to talk about is that the live action cut this scene a little earlier than the manga. Here, we see how Zeph starts talking about the vastness of the ocean and how he's been in some tough spots in the past, and that he always thought that it would be great if there was a restaurant right in the middle of nowhere. I love the small detail that the idea of the Baratia restaurant comes from here, where Zeph swears that if he survives this rock, then he'll build something like that, even if it's the last thing he does. We also see Sanji swear that he'll help Zeph, that he'll become strong, and as we already know, he kept that promise. The problem is that Zeph never asked for that promise, and Luffy understands that, while Sanji can't see that due to his own guilt. When we jump back to the present time, we see that Pearl is continuing beating up Sanji until Luffy finally can't take it anymore and severs one of the fins of Baratia. He even threatens to sink the whole ship. Him and Sanji get into an argument, and Luffy says exactly what Zeph couldn't make Sanji understand all this time. That Sanji isn't repaying his debt at all by staying in the restaurant, or worse, by dying for it. Luffy can understand that clearly because he himself has been in a similar situation as well, with Shanks. The live action also drew that parallel, but there it was a light-hearted moment, without the depth shown in the manga through this argument. Also, as a general small detail, I love when fictional stories portray characters arguing if that leads to a better understanding later on. And I think that with Luffy, any argument with his crewmates hits especially hard due to his honest nature. Another small detail I want to mention is that when Luffy threatens to sink Baratia, it brings back the whole discussion about killing off characters versus taking away their dreams and metaphorically killing them in that way that I spoke about in one of my earlier reviews. But going back to the plot, this is the part where Gin jumps into action and destroys Pearl in one move. This was a fantastic moment for his character emotionally, but it was also a great plot twist because we find out that he is actually the battle commander of the whole armada. This is something I didn't expect at all. I genuinely thought he was just one of the low-level pirates under Krieg. The beginning of chapter 60 was very funny. Sanji and Luffy were verbally destroying Krieg's pirates. After Gin offered his version of mercy, Sanji simply told him to eat shit, and Luffy added that they'd never lose to a bunch of wimps, and that the only thing that Krieg's pirates have are numbers. The pirates were drawn as if they were actually taking physical hits with each new insult, which was very funny. The best part was that while the cooks were panicking at this provocation, Zeph looked like he was having a blast watching it all. After that, Krieg gets involved with the fight directly. I love the consistency of characterization. We know he's a trickster, like the fact that one of the strategies he has is to steal harmless-looking ships and then attack from there. I love how that applies on a smaller scale too, and how it translates into his fighting style. He says he'll attack with poison gas, but in reality sends a shuriken bomb. Also, while I already knew Luffy can get cut, it still always feels weird to see him actually taking hits and getting injured. Sooner or later, I feel like we have to get a fight where Luffy loses, and loses badly, and I am curious about the extent of damage One Piece is willing to show. But in terms of action in this volume, my favorite fight was definitely Sanji against Gin. Sanji was obviously already in a bad shape even before this fight, and Gin is apparently a demon, but I still loved how Sanji didn't go down easily. It was a cool detail how he threw his cigarette into Gin's eye to distract him and get one good kick in. And the best part is that throughout this fight, Sanji kept shit-talking despite the dire situation. I hope he never loses this quality. Another great but easy to miss detail was that we saw Gin mess up his attack against Sanji on purpose, and Sanji immediately called him out on that. I get the feeling that Sanji really hates when someone insults his competence in any way. However, here Sanji was in such a bad shape that one missed attack didn't do much good, and he ended up at Gin's mercy. I love that Sanji actually lost this fight, and it was the opponent's feelings that decided the outcome. It makes it so much more interesting than giving us just pure action with no real substance behind it. Gin might be a demon, but he's not heartless. I love how this scene showed that kindness pays off, even if it's not immediate. Sanji fed him, so now Gin is sparing him. I also feel like thematically, it ties a little bit to the Sanji-Zeph backstory too, because it shows that you never know what will happen, you never know what consequences your actions will have, but you still have to decide what kind of person do you want to be in any given moment, someone who helps or someone who harms. Krieg is obviously not happy about that, so this time he sends the actual gas bomb. I also liked the small fun callback to the Marine full body. Just a little detail to make the world feel more connected. We see Luffy's determination to defend everyone here, but what I liked even more was how Gin stayed loyal to Krieg to the end, even if Krieg didn't deserve that loyalty. But this scene was supposed to speak about Gin's character, not Krieg's, and it absolutely did. I doubt his stance will change, but I also believe that Luffy will defeat Krieg, so I'm curious what Gin's character resolution will be. We were shown that the rest of the crew were shocked about Krieg turning against Gin, so perhaps they'll choose to follow Gin instead when this fight is over. The ending part of the volume was great. I loved how Luffy threw two masks for Sanji and Gin, and as soon as he thought he needs a mask for himself, one landed right beside him. For the readers, it was obvious that it was Gin who must have thrown that mask, but Luffy didn't know that, so I loved how the story kept twisting the knife by showing Luffy's relief about the situation. When the gas cleared, it was revealed that Gin actually forced the mask on Sanji. This was such a badass moment for him, because Sanji clearly did struggle, but Gin still managed to keep that mask in place for 5 whole minutes while being poisoned himself. And that's where the volume ends. It seems like next volume we should finally get to the Krieg vs. Luffy fight. I have no idea how long it will be, but I don't see it lasting more than a few chapters, so I think that the next volume might actually end with our crew moving on to the Arlong arc. I think I'll reserve my final opinions when comparing the Baratia arc in the manga and in the live action for when this arc is actually complete, but Volume 7 really blew me away. The last thing I want to talk about are the cover stories. In this volume, those few pages really made me love Buggy's crew in a way that the entire arc about them failed to do. We saw the crew hold funeral for Buggy, then we saw how Moji and Kabaji tried to fight for the title of the captain, and after a very long and exhausting battle, the one who won was Richie the Lion, who defeated both of them while asleep and dreaming that he was fighting dragons. It was so ridiculous, and I loved every page. This part made me see Buggy's crew as an actual crew, and not just a dictator with a bunch of background characters following them. And those were my final thoughts about this volume. Thank you for listening. Share your own thoughts in the comments, and if you are interested, you can subscribe and I'll see you again as I review Volume 8.